Scotland, just like this morning. And then, just like today, we're going to watch the showers breaking out. Probably not as intense, and there's a bit more movement to them, so they'll be moving through a bit more readily during Friday. And Wales, South West England looking a lot drier tomorrow. But notice cloud and rain spilling into Northern Ireland. That is the next weather system that's going to bring some heavy rain and gusty winds likely during Friday evening. That'll steadily spread across the country on Friday night and into the weekend. Elsewhere, things getting a little drier, certainly to start with over the weekend. But that weather front will bring some rain edging in from the west during Saturday, and then a ridge of high pressure should bring some drier weather as we go into next week.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About on GB News with me, Alex Phillips, where we get stuck into the day's big issues that need looking at in depth. Nothing is off the table and no one will be cancelled for saying exactly what they think. And here's what's coming up on the show. It's the final day of the NATO summit in Madrid, but after days of talks, are members really on the same page, especially when it comes to dealing with Putin and Ukraine? And could we be facing a snap election if Sir Keir Starmer is forced to quit as Labour leader over Beergate? Well, the Prime Minister hasn't ruled it out. And drug regulators assess medicines before they hit the market. But do they have enough independence from the companies they regulate? That's all we're talking about for the next hour. What do you want to talk about? Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or tweet me @gbnews. First, it's time for the GB News headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 1 minute past 2. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB Newsroom. A mother and stepfather have been jailed for life for the murder of 5-year-old Logan Mwangi. 31-year-old Ancharev Williamson will serve a minimum of 28 years for the murder of her son. 40-year-old John Cole will serve a minimum of 29 years. A 14-year-old boy who can't be named for legal reasons has also been sentenced to life. He'll serve a minimum of 15 years. Boris Johnson says NATO must explode the myth that the alliance is an aggressor on the world stage. It's as the UK commits an extra £1 billion towards boosting Ukraine's capabilities, including its air defence systems. Speaking on the last day of the summit in Madrid, the Prime Minister also said Russia's decision to abandon the strategic Black Sea outpost of Snake Island was evidence of Ukraine's ability to fight back. Boris Johnson insisted the alliance must make it clear to the world that Russia is the only aggressor in this conflict.
We need to explode the myth that it was in any way NATO that had responsibility for provoking the conflict. Nothing could be further from the truth. And if you want proof that NATO is a purely defensive alliance, you could have no more eloquent testimony than the accession of Finland and Sweden, quintessentially peace-loving countries.
Meanwhile, the Secretary-General of NATO has said Sweden and Finland will sign the accession protocol to formally join the alliance on Tuesday. Also speaking at the summit earlier, Jens Stoltenberg said that when it comes to Russian aggression, NATO is preparing for any eventuality.
We face the most serious security situation in decades, but we are rising to the challenge with unity and resolve. The decisions you have taken in Madrid will ensure that our alliance continue to preserve peace, prevent conflict, and protect our people and our values. Europe and North America standing together in NATO.
Well, Boris Johnson's committing to Britain to increase its defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by the end of the decade. It follows mounting criticism of government plans to cut 10,000 British troops over the next 3 years. Former Tory Defence Minister Tobias Ellwood told the Commons he believes MPs would vote to reverse the move and the nation would support them.
Clearly not the time to be cutting our army by 10,000 troops, because this sends a clear message to Putin that we're not in it for the long haul. We can't sustain 2 battle groups in Estonia and place pressure on the army to conduct all its other duties to keep the nation safe. Mr. Speaker, can we have a debate and indeed a vote on reversing these cuts? If there was a free vote, I know how the House would act, and they would have the nation's support.
The former Joint General Secretary of Unite says British Airways must reverse its 10% pay cut for workers to tackle airport delays. That as Heathrow's ordered the cancellation of 30 flights. Earlier, thousands of travellers were disrupted by a rare schedule intervention, with many not realising their journey had been scrapped until they arrived at the airport. Heathrow bosses say they're working with airlines to get those affected rebooked on alternative flights. Well, our reporter Rosie Wright joins us now from Heathrow Airport. Rosie, what's the latest? Can we expect further disruption over the weekend?
Yes, and to be really clear, this was Heathrow Airport's decision to cancel those flights, and they told the airlines, you've got to take them off. British Airways were the most affected. They're the largest carrier out of Heathrow Airport, which is our busiest airport. But I've spoken to Heathrow in the last hour, and they've made it really clear to me. Today was exceptional. I said, look, passenger confidence is quite low. We know there's strikes coming up. There's been long queues in security. There have been problems with not enough baggage handlers. They said currently right now there are no cancellations scheduled for tomorrow or across the weekend. That's not enough good news, though, for the people who were scheduled on those 30 flights that were supposed to take off today. Many of them only realised when they arrived at the airport this morning that they wouldn't be taking off, and instead they'd have to find an alternative route.
Rosie, thank you. Rosie Wright at Heathrow Airport for us. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens now, though it's back to Alex with We Need to Talk About.
Beware China. That's the message coming out of NATO for the first time in its history. China is not our adversary, Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said, but we must be clear-eyed about the serious challenges it represents. Those challenges include substantially building up its military forces, including nuclear weapons, bullying its neighbours, controlling its citizens through advanced technology, and spreading Russian disinformation. But is all of NATO really on the same page? Alarmingly not, it seems, and perhaps most pointedly when it comes to France, one of only 8 nuclear-capable countries in the world and once global leader in the technology. Macron signed a huge nuclear agreement with Beijing back in February, which the Chinese Communist Party's National Development Commission said enabled China to benefit from France's unique advantage in advanced manufacturing and engineering construction. A deal done not long after Australia dumped an agreement with Paris for diesel-powered submarines in favour of UK and US nuclear-powered vessels using small modular reactors, a highly coveted technology in today's changing world. Well, Beijing was hardly warm and fuzzy about the AUKUS pact either, saying it intensified the arms race. So what is France playing at? Playing both sides, it seems. Hardly the stuff of NATO unity. Well, joining me now on the show is retired Rear Admiral in the US Navy, Mike Hewitt. Mike, fantastic to have you on. What do you make of NATO's warning today about China? Rather unprecedented, but in due time?
It is. I think the summit that they just concluded in Madrid is probably one of the most impactful NATO summits since the end of the Cold War. I think it's long overdue that we recognize that China also is an adversary and has strategic influence in the region, Europe, and in other areas outside of just Europe. So the idea that we are realigning the strategic plan of NATO to consider strategic threats such as China is really long overdue.
And do you think that everybody is aligned in NATO on this? Because there are lots of countries, when I look through the list of NATO member states, who one could argue have been rather compromised by China's Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, Montenegro, for example, with a huge debt to China for road infrastructure. Italy, famously approached by China, especially during the pandemic, to help rebuild their infrastructure. How bound are NATO member states when it comes to China's leverage?
I think every nation in NATO is guilty in some way, shape, or form of some kind of globalization or economic entanglement with China for the last 15 or 20 years. And we're just now recognizing the impact of that. The US and the UK are just as guilty as others. I think this recent development with France is somewhat, as you say, playing both sides. I'm very disappointed in any collaboration with China over nuclear power. And as I've mentioned before on your show, long ago, we ceded the Chinese our nuclear capability in the civilian side. And so any collaboration with the Chinese, particularly with respect to the Belt and Road Initiative, where they are actively engaging in building Chinese nuclear power plants globally, is an area that we should really be cautious about. Because again, it does go counter to the recent declaration that China is an adversary for NATO.
I mean, China's response to what NATO has said, particularly to comments made by our Foreign Secretary Liz Truss about potentially pre-arming Taiwan, has been met fairly robustly and regarded as provocative. Do you think that talking about Taiwan and whether or not we should be providing weaponry to Taiwan to create a more asymmetric defence system is provocative or merely preventative?
We've been in this conversation about defending Taiwan for a long, long time, and the U.S. has really led this conversation. So I think it is important now that if we're going to consider China an adversary, and as you know, the Queen Elizabeth, HMS Queen Elizabeth, sailed into the Pacific just last year. So I think the expansion of NATO capability into the Pacific is very important. The defense of Taiwan is something that we will continue to talk about. Our concern is that with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, are the Chinese watching that invasion and determining for themselves whether or not this is their chance to move on Taiwan? That's something we are very concerned about.
And in terms of the relationship between China and Russia, how significant is it that now Russia has become the biggest energy supplier to China? It used to, of course, be Saudi Arabia. And, of course, that invasion was potentially delayed until after the start of the Winter Olympics, at which Putin was China's special guest. How cosy are they? Or is China in a position where it might not be doing things to actively stop Russia from engaging in war in Ukraine, it potentially is turning a blind eye but doesn't want it to escalate? What's your read of that?
My read of that is that it's much more strategic and complex than simply deciding to ignore the invasion of Ukraine. The joint statement that came out of the Russian Federation and the Chinese Communist Party at the beginning of the Beijing Olympics was a signal to the world that they are realigning as authoritarian powers globally, not just economically, but militarily, and in some ways threatening to say that democracy is really up for grabs right now. And perhaps they represent the future of relationships globally. I think that what China is doing is a very strategic partnership with Russia. I also think Russia, in many ways, got the green light from China on the invasion of Ukraine. They obviously timed it for post-Beijing Olympics. And in many ways, the Chinese have remained very silent on the matter. And as you mentioned, the Chinese have picked up a lot of the economics that were taken away from Russia with the sanctions. So the Chinese are much more heavily involved in Russian activity. Now, it may not be the kind of cozy relationship that we think about with NATO, but they are clearly working together in many, many places right now.
And the rhetoric coming out of NATO is indeed publicly reassuring based on what you've said, but can we trust that the collective initiative will trump national self-interest, particularly when it comes to countries engaging in business with China?
I think we're going to have to watch and see how this goes, because I think we are so entangled with the Chinese, and even in the UK, and we've talked about all the entanglement with the Chinese at Hinkley Point, with their funding, and of course in the past with Huawei and 5G. So kind of untangling from the Chinese is something we clearly need to do in our national interest. Does that mean that the Germans and the French will follow suit? It's going to be hard to say right now. I think we really need to take a hard look at what China is doing with its Belt and Road Initiative and unrestricted warfare. And much of what they're doing in this kind of globalization of the economy is nothing more than predatory mercantilism. And we've seen them do this with weaker nations time and time again. And we are not immune to that same kind of activity amongst the NATO nations. So I think we should pay very close attention to what China is going to do in response to this announcement by NATO.
Mike, thank you so much. Always a pleasure having you on the programme. Rear Admiral Mike Hewitt there, who's a former advisor to the Pentagon. Now, as headlines today have been dominated by NATO's rhetoric on China, Russia still remains at the forefront of the organisation's concern as the bloc intensively rearms in what some commentators are calling the new Iron Curtain. Well, joining me now on the show is former intelligence analyst for ex-Soviet states Ewan Grant. Plus, in the studio with me today as my presenter friend is political commentator Benedict Spence. Ewan, I'm going to start with you. There were a bit of sort of measured celebration, perhaps, that the Russians have been pushed back from Snake Island. But are we being a little bit too quick in celebrating sort of what appear to be small victories when it comes to the war in Ukraine? Are Russia really on the back foot and in decline?
I think we are being too premature. I think it's great news, Snake Island. Strategically, if it gets step forward towards a grain corridor out, perhaps the Russians have been squeezed by the Egyptians, India, other countries, put the pressure on them, and they've decided we might want to give something here for a while. But the thrust of your question is correct. We've been, I think, a little bit premature and too optimistic for quite some time now. Eventually, at current rates of consumption, Ukraine will run out of artillery shells with not enough replacement from the West, because it's not just shells that can go in barrels. They're not compatible. So the answer is yes, and we need to keep up as much support and win as much time for Ukraine. NATO has time for Russia and for China, but Ukraine doesn't have time. So we need to keep that up.
I mean, the announcement today that £1 billion more in arms support is going to Kiev from the United Kingdom, making the UK second only to America when it comes to arming Ukraine. Is there still way too much hesitancy when it comes to other European nations in committing the sort of weaponry that Ukraine needs to start pushing the Russians back, and also too much hesitancy when it comes to actually applying sanctions that would really hit Russia hard?
Yes to both questions. That obviously doesn't quite apply to Poland. It doesn't apply to the Baltic states, who have given so much of their limited resources and huge amounts on a per capita basis. It does, I'm afraid, and the Admiral and yourself commented on this, it does still apply to France and Germany. It's turning. I think Macron did get quite a bit of pressure at G7, because remember, G7 and indeed the NATO summits, not just NATO members. You've got Australia, Japan and South Korea, who are major partners in the Quad with the US in tackling China. But I'm still very worried about France and Germany. I've worked with officials from those countries, and I'm particularly concerned about Germany. The ethos is different. They would like this to go away.
And, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because Germany, of course, now concerned that Russia could easily turn off their gas supply via Nord Stream 2. Is that largely what is holding these countries back, the economic ties with Russia? And on that front, how much longer do you think Russia can go on? What's it going to take to stop Putin once and for all?
I think, yes, to your point about gas and oil, as I've mentioned on your programmes before, I referred to several Tom Clancy books, one of which, The Last Written in His Lifetime, which was a textbook for the invasion of Ukraine. It's not a work of fiction almost, it's a textbook. And it's no coincidence, key parts of the plot were cutting off gas and oil supplies and the leverage that gave Russia. As regards how long can he hold, now that's a difficult one. I think there will be a pause, probably in a few weeks, as they regroup and try and build up their stocks or move their troops around, because remember, they've done that before. It then becomes, can Putin get a diplomatic settlement? And as Martin Sixsmith warned a few days ago, does that mean he's gone away or he's planning to come back? And Martin Sixsmith is not the only commentator worried that he may come back sooner rather than later, next spring after the winter, when we've all been worried about gas prices and keeping warm. He'll be building up. We have to assume a worst case and plan to avoid that.
I mean, fascinating comments by you and there, Benedict. You and I have been following this for a long time now. Is some of the rhetoric coming out of countries like France, who have been hinting about a degree of appeasement, a settlement, a ceasefire, simply going to give Putin the opportunity to re-strategise, regroup and remobilise at the cost of us all?
Possibly. I mean, it's interesting to touch upon France's relationships with China, certainly in the nuclear industry, because if you're wanting to sort of divest yourself away from Russian fossil fuels, you have to deal with things like nuclear rather than renewables in the short term. What country lies between Russia and China? It's Kazakhstan. It's where the Belt and Road Initiative was actually launched by Xi Jinping all those years ago, and it produces 40% of the world's uranium. Right there, you can see actually, from a France's perspective, those power stations, they're going to get built. That uranium's going to get mined. It's going to get used either way. You might as well be the one to insert yourself between Russia and China, because, of course, those are the two countries that have the most influence over Kazakhstan. You might as well be the one to try to do well for yourself and perhaps for your neighbours out of, striking some sort of agreement, rather than leaving it to Russia and China to fight it out over themselves, because then you're not getting any sort of benefit. And, I do think, as much as it really doesn't sit very well, the idea of other countries sort of looking to China, doing business with China, we can't get away from the fact that we have allowed China, or China has allowed itself, to become the major second power in the world. You can't just cut yourself off from it like we've tried to do with Russia. It's far too deeply embedded in all of our economies. So as much as we might long-term like to divest ourselves, if in the short term you'd actually quite like to get away from Putin's oil and his gas, you're going to have to be dealing with uranium production. And there is a lot of that in Australia. There is a lot of that in Canada. There's not so much in the United States as it used to be. Where else? Kazakhstan. So that's ultimately where this is all going to be played out. It's going to be played out in Central Asia. And it's why things like the United States pulling out of Afghanistan in the way that it did, sort of even at the time, didn't look particularly good. But in hindsight, you're sort of sitting there thinking, you know, if you want to be playing the geopolitical game, you can't just be, withdrawing and say, that's it, we're not going to deal with you, because other players will fill the vacuum and say, thanks very much.
Ewan, Benedict, fascinating comments. Who knew that Kazakhstan was going to pop up today? That's something definitely worth exploring.
Everything's connected.
Yeah, isn't it just? Geopolitics is like a giant game of foreign affairs chess. Thank you both. Really fascinating comments. Enjoyed that a lot. Well, meanwhile, our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, watched the Prime Minister speak at the NATO summit in Madrid within the last hour, and he sent us this report.
Well, the Prime Minister wrapped up this NATO summit insisting that it had been a good one, that NATO was resolute in its defence of Ukraine, that it was going to provide extra resources for Ukraine. We know the British government have announced there's going to be an extra £1 billion provided to the Ukrainian government, and there will be extra British troops going to NATO's eastern flank as well. And the Prime Minister also significantly said that Britain, along with other NATO countries, will now start contributing 2.5% of their GDP towards defence spending by the end of the decade. That is a big increase in defence spending, not in the immediate term, but in the years to come. When he was asked about whether clearly this war is having an effect on the world economy, on inflation, particularly back in Britain, he essentially said that the inflation, the Ukraine-linked inflation, was the cost of freedom, which was always worth paying. Very defensive in many ways, insisting that Ukraine, NATO needed to stick the path to try and defeat Vladimir Putin in Russia. The Prime Minister pretty pleased with how this summit has gone. It is at the end of 9 days the Prime Minister's been away from. He is now on the plane, essentially heading back to the UK, heading back, it must be said, to some domestic difficulties too, though he did remark that he's looking forward to getting home, because home is home.
Darren McCaffrey, our political editor there. You're with GB News on TV and radio. Coming up, the mother and stepfather of 5-year-old Logan Mwangi have been jailed for life for his murder. We'll have the latest from court. Before that, though, it's a short break.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Welcome back. You're with Alex Phillips on GB News. The mother and stepfather of 5-year-old Logan Mwangi have been jailed for life for his murder. Ang Haddad Williamson, John Cole were found guilty in April. A 14-year-old boy who cannot be named because of his age was detained for a minimum of 15 years after also being found guilty of Logan's murder. Logan Mwangi's body was dumped in a river after suffering what prosecutors called a brutal and sustained attack. It's the latest in a string of appalling and tragic murders of children by their own parents. GB News reporter Jeff Moody has the background on the case.
A mother's worst nightmare.
Please help me, please. Where are you? My son's not here. My boyfriend's not here. Take a breath. Take a breath.
Except this was an elaborate performance, as was this.
I feel so useless, Dad.
I know. By the time police arrived at the house of 5-year-old Logan Mwangi, the little boy was already dead, and his mother knew it. He'd been the victim of a brutal and sustained assault. Prosecutors say he'd suffered 56 internal injuries, injuries usually seen only in victims of a high-speed car crash. In July last year, he tested positive for COVID. His mother and stepfather made him stand for hours on end, facing the wall, racist taunts ringing in his ears. And they kept him prisoner. Within days, he was dead. It was this footage that first aroused suspicions. While Logan's mother breaks down, the washing machine is at full pelt. It's stuffed with bloody sheets from the boy's bed. And then came this, CCTV footage from neighbours showing John Cole and another boy removing Logan's body from the house, dumping it in the River Ogmore. Logan Mwangi's mother, Angharad Williamson, his stepfather John Cole and a third defendant, a 14-year-old boy who cannot be named for legal reasons, pleaded not guilty to murder at Cardiff Crown Court, but a jury found otherwise. After the verdict, Logan's father spoke of the most beautiful boy whose life had been cut tragically short.
The world is a colder and darker place without his smile and happy energy in which he lived his life. The hole that has been left in the hearts of all who knew and loved him will never be filled.
The authorities already knew Logan was at risk. He'd been on the Child Protection Register but was removed just a month before his death. A child practice review will now examine in detail the actions of the authorities. A report is due in the autumn. Only then will the question be answered. Could more have been done to save this little boy's life? Jeff Moody, GB News.
Well, Jeff Moody joins us now live from Cardiff Crown Court. Jeff, an emotional and harrowing case. Tell us what happened in court.
Well, in her sentencing, the judge, Mrs. Justice Jefford, said it's impossible to imagine the terror in a 5-year-old boy at the hands of the people who were meant to protect him. She went on to say that Logan would have suffered anguish at seeing the role that his own mother played in his death. Well, as you can imagine, there were visible gasps as the sentence was read out. In his victim statement, the father, Ben Mwangi, said, "I am devastated that I wasn't there to protect him." He talked of having recurring nightmares since this happened. He says he often wakes up screaming and crying and says no amount of time can possibly heal the wounds inflicted. Well, immediately after the sentence, this is what South Wales Police had to say.
It's incomprehensible that Logan had his life cut short in such tragic circumstances at the hands of those very people who should have been there to protect him. For Logan's father Ben, who stands beside me, today's sentences are welcome news. However, no amount of justice can bring Logan back or compensate for the grief that continues to be felt.
Well, as you say, it was a highly emotional case, and because of the nature of the case, the judge has said that the jury need never perform jury service duties again. There will be a review into what happened because Logan was on the Child Protection Register. He was known to social services, but he was removed from that register just 1 month before his murder. Social workers came to visit him in the days leading up to his murder, but because the little boy was in isolation due to COVID, nobody got to see him. So questions now whether anything more could have been done to prevent his death.
Jeff, thank you very much. Jeff Moody there. You're with GB News on TV and DAB radio. Coming up, we're going to be talking about how Boris Johnson won't rule out a snap election if Sir Keir Starmer is forced to quit as Labour leader. Now, though, it's time for a check on the news headlines.
It's 2:31. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The mother and stepfather of 5-year-old Logan Mwangi have been jailed for life for his murder. The youngster, whose battered body was found dumped in a river in July last year, had suffered 56 external cuts and bruises, as well as catastrophic internal injuries. Senior Investigating Officer Detective Inspector Leanne Rees says the sentences have delivered justice for Logan's father.
It's incomprehensible that Logan had his life cut short in such tragic circumstances at the hands of those very people who should have been there to protect him. For Logan's father Ben, who stands beside me, today's sentences are welcome news. However, no amount of justice can bring Logan back or compensate for the grief that continues to be felt.
Boris Johnson's committing Britain to increase its defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by the end of the decade. The Prime Minister says the spending targets of 2% set by NATO members a decade ago were for a very different era. Speaking on the last day of the NATO summit in Madrid, Mr Johnson also said Russia's the only aggressor in the Ukraine conflict.
We need to explode the myth that it was in any way NATO that had responsibility for provoking the conflict. Nothing could be further from the truth. And if you want proof that NATO is a purely defensive alliance, you could have no more eloquent testimony than the accession of Finland and Sweden, quintessentially peace-loving countries.
TV online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. It's back to we need to talk about with Alex in just a moment.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
As if we needed more political drama at home. With so much taking place abroad, there are now whispers in newspaper columns today that a snap election could be called if Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer is forced to resign, having condemned himself to that fate if Durham police issue him a fine for COVID infractions. The idea is that the Conservatives could take advantage of Labour infighting, while perhaps also sparing themselves the pain of deepening public discontent and future winter suffering over the state of the nation's free-falling economy. Also looming is the fallout from the Parliamentary Standards Committee, who have started their investigation into whether the Prime Minister misled Parliament. Meanwhile, elections to the infamous Conservative 1922 committee, able to hold a vote of no confidence on the party leader, will also take place in weeks, with rumours that some are on manoeuvres to flood the powerful body with anti-Boris figures who could rewrite the rules to push for his downfall. Just as the country is crying out for a steady hand on the tiller, we look set to have anything but. Well, joining me to discuss the blue-on-blue battle and whether an election is really what the country needs is Claire Pearsall, Conservative councillor and commentator. Claire, always great to have you on the programme. I mean, snap election. Anyone listening to this right now would think, why? Why? So answer that for me. Why?
I don't think there will be one, if I'm brutally honest with you, because you're right. What would be the point in holding a snap election in the autumn, given everything the country is currently going through? I have been in Westminster this week and I have spoken to MPs, and the rumour mill is working overtime. And I kind of think that's almost what Downing Street wants, because there is nothing better to focus the minds of MPs than the threat of an election coming up. So it just will maybe aid them to get back into line, to work together more as a party, especially as we enter the summer, which is going to be incredibly difficult.
Is this in the lights, do you think, of potential rebellion stirring behind the scenes? I mean, there are some calling the Parliamentary Standards Committee a kangaroo court, although it is heavily dominated by Conservative members of Parliament, 4 out of the 7. Meanwhile, the 1922 elections, which could see a new body controlling that, and some saying they want to try and make sure that the people at the tiller there are potentially not Boris Johnson allies.
I mean, there's a lot of talk about that and a lot of speculation that putting a slate together of anti-Prime Minister candidates for the 1922 will make a change of rules happen. Well, that isn't guaranteed. And when you do speak to MPs, the vast majority of them don't want the rules to change because they feel that it's not actually the way that we do things. Just because we didn't like the result, perhaps, that was given to us over the vote of no confidence, doesn't mean that we go back and change the rules. So I think this is a very small group of MPs putting that particular rumour around. I am not convinced that the party as a whole would vote for that. So I think, again, this is just a little bit of mischief making, as we've seen with rumours that started the week of 6 Tory MPs that were defecting to Labour. Nothing happened, and I suspect the same is true in this case.
Commentators have often said that Margaret Thatcher found solace in going to the big international events when she was in trouble domestically. It's a great excuse to sort of get away from troubles at home, but also try and bolster support from people, being strong-armed on the world stage. Do you see reflections of that in the way Boris Johnson is proceeding at the moment?
I think there's probably a little bit of that. He always tends to go and speak to Volodymyr Zelensky when things are tough at home. But also, he is the Prime Minister, and these are important meetings that are going ahead, you know, NATO and the G7. You couldn't just absent yourself because there's a little bit of local difficulty at home. So I think that he is doing exactly what a Prime Minister needs to do. I think he will seek solace, but he does have to come back and face his colleagues who have had all week without the headmaster being in town.
Claire Pearsall, love your comments, as always. Thank you so much for coming on, Tory councillor and political commentator there. Well, Benedict, what are your views on this? Claire there saying that nothing whips your own MPs into line than the threat of a looming election and people worried about their own seats. But in some respects, if the Conservatives were pricing in the fallout from economic crisis, from whatever might happen when it comes to the Parliamentary Standards Committee, there might actually be some logic in going early, especially if the Labour Party are tearing themselves apart over their own leadership election.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Right now, the Tory party finds itself in a position where everything is sort of slowly drifting away, everything is slowly getting worse. You know, it's a while, actually, since Boris Johnson has had anything that I think you could call a win. You know, even when he managed to survive the vote of confidence, it still wasn't, you know, seen as a glowing endorsement of him. And that's the problem, is that the economic situation is going to keep getting worse because of reasons that are outside of his remit, ultimately. You know, we have to be honest about that. And ultimately, the other thing that is going reasonably well, or has been, his support of Ukraine, as we've just been touching upon, isn't necessarily something that you can guarantee is going to continue going your own way. So, yeah, something has to change. And it's the sort of curveball approach that you could imagine coming from Boris Johnson. I mean, it would take a sort of unusual set of circumstances. The danger is, of course, if Keir Starmer resigns and the Labour Party manages to put somebody forward that's actually very impressive, although, options on the back of a postcard as to who that might be. For the time being, I think Boris Johnson's biggest strength remains the fact that nobody in the Tory party is prepared to put their hand forward and say, yes, I'm a viable alternative to him. But things keep trundling forward. And ultimately, if we were to sort of stick out the next 18 months on the current trajectory, I think he'd end up going into a general election looking like he would probably lose it or face a hung parliament by virtue of the fact that he wasn't able to change anything, he wasn't able to sort of seize the initiative, and power and influence just slowly slipped away from him.
There'll be people watching this thinking it's very unhelpful when you're trying to discuss unity in NATO to have all of this domestic politicking back at home, potentially weakening the position of the Prime Minister when the UK is at the vanguard of providing support to Ukraine. But how much do you think that international politicians pay attention to that kind of stuff?
I think they do up to a certain point, but I think the important thing to remember is that most domestic politicians do not really care about external events. They care about themselves, they care about their seats, because actually without those seats, they have no ability to affect any other kind of changes. So they are selfish in that instance. And I don't think that Boris Johnson cares too much beyond saving his own skin, ultimately. That's what a lot of this is. I don't think it's necessarily any sort of great moral crusade against Vladimir Putin, especially if you look at his rap sheet whilst he was mayor of London and how much Russian money came into the city. So, I don't think that we should pay too much attention to that. It's ultimately about people looking out for themselves. If Boris Johnson thinks that this is in his interests, forget the interests of Ukraine or NATO or even the country that he happens to govern, then he's going to do it.
Well, time will tell. I have a suspicion that it's probably not going to happen, but what do I know? Who am I to say? Benedict, thank you. And thank you for bringing up the Russian money story as well, because we are going to be discussing that later in the programme. Well, when it comes to the medicines we take, we want to trust that what we are prescribed is safe and it will do the job we are taking it for. To make sure that's the case, the pharmaceutical industry is heavily regulated. But where do these regulators get their money? What if I told you some of it comes from the very industry it is governing? Does that surprise you? What might surprise you more is quite how much. Well, the BMJ has today published peer-reviewed analysis into just that, and the findings are shocking. The BMJ asked regulators in Australia, Canada, Europe, Japan, the UK and the US a series of questions about their annual budget's funding. And here is how they compared. In Australia, the regulator takes 96% of its funding from pharma. In Europe, it's 89%. Here in the UK, self-venerating over its National Health Service, the medicines watchdog, the MHRA, gets a whopping 86% of its funding from industry giants. In America, often demonised for its private healthcare model, it's 65%. And in Canada, it's just over half. Well, should we be worried? It's hard to trust what we are prescribed is free from the interests of big business when it comes to details like that. Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Aseem Malhotra, consultant cardiologist and president of the Public Health Collaboration. Aseem, what's your take on that? I was astonished to find out that the industry regulator in the UK, 86% coming from big pharma. I mean, that seems like a giant, a clash of interests.
Yeah, this investigation by Marion Damasi for the BMJ is, as you've said already, deeply shocking, but perhaps not surprising. It's a gross conflict of interest. And as described in her article, this is a symptom of institutional corruption, if you like. And the problem is that when you have such gross conflicts of interest, and we know historically that the regulators, the drugs that get approved, they're not rigorously evaluated, they're not independent, they withhold data on harms quite often, and they're essentially not fit for purpose. And it's highlighted in the article as well by one commentator that we have to actually treat until the system changes, we can't fully trust the regulator to be doing its job properly. They're not fit for purpose. And I think the other thing to add in as well, Alex, I mean, I've been giving lectures on this particular topic and this area of pharmaceutical industry influence over clinical decision-making over the last few weeks. And one very senior NHS leader who came to one of my lectures was not aware. He was shocked about this specific data. For example, 86% of the funding of the MHRA in this country comes from the pharmaceutical industry. And this particular person actually has been quite influential, certainly in trying to encourage people to uptake the vaccine or other drugs in the mainstream media and even in his own practice. And he wasn't aware of it. So I think this highlights something else, is that doctors, patients, the general population don't know what's happening, and they don't even know that they don't know.
I mean, there have been lots of reports lately that in the UK we are a very overdrugged country, that people are taking far too many medicines and that some of them are having extremely serious interactions with other medicines, landing a lot of elderly people, especially in hospital. Now, in this report, we know now that the pharmaceutical industry is funding the regulators, but does that, in your opinion, create a direct stream of influence from the big pharma to the regulator?
Absolutely. So also what's highlighted in this really brilliant article, it's very rigorous, so people should, it's open access, you can get hold of it and read it yourself. It's shown over the years, as there's been more funding coming from the drug industry for approval of drugs, the quality of the evidence is reduced. And if you look at actually data even going back many years, for example, of the 3,000 health interventions that are carried out in Europe, only 11% of them are thought to be truly beneficial for patients. Over 150 million euros a day is wasted because of corruption in healthcare systems. And this is something that, is a huge issue. It's a major issue because if you look at, and I've analysed this myself, if you look at the impact of drugs that have been approved, say, in Europe and across the Western world over the last 2 to 3 decades, Alex, most of those drugs have been proven to be copies of old ones. And actually only a very small minority have been shown to be truly beneficial, and many to be more harmful than beneficial. So what do we conclude from that? Well, the overall net effect of the drug industry on society, in my view, has been a negative one in the last few decades. And part of the reason for that is there's been increasing deregulation. So you go back to the late 80s or early 90s, only a small proportion of the funding of the regulator came from the drug industry. Most of it was publicly funded. So where do we go from here? I think one of the key things is, although drug companies, should be developing drugs, they should have no role in testing them, and certainly not then hiding the data. The regulators should be publicly funded. And I think until all of this changes, one of the things, and I have conversations with patients and about this all the time, and they're shocked and actually, to be honest, outraged by this situation they're not aware of. I think until the situation changes, people need to understand that all drug industry-sponsored trials should be seen as marketing until proven otherwise.
These are extremely strident things that you're saying. They are backed up by a peer-reviewed report in the BMJ, leading medical journal. I mean, how worried should we really be? It's quite easy to paint a picture of nefarious goings-on, of big pharma as a huge shadowy industry who doesn't care about our health, only about their profit margins. I mean, is it really that bad, or is this a case of looking at something which could become potentially quite serious in certain areas if it isn't sorted out now?
I think it's very bad, actually. And it comes back to really the legal obligation of the drug industry. People need to understand is to produce profit for shareholders. They have no legal obligation to give you the best treatment. But the real scandal, and this was pointed out by cardiologist Peter Wilmshurst in the Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine in a talk he gave in 2015, the real scandal is that doctors, institutions, medical journals collude with industry for financial gain, and the regulators fail to prevent misconduct by industry. And we have a wealth of evidence of fraud that's been committed by the pharmaceutical industry over the years, but for them it's the cost of business, because even though they've committed fraud, and we're talking about most of the top 10 pharmaceutical companies, and don't have to name any particular one over the years, even though they've committed fraud, in almost all of those cases, nobody got fired, no one lost their job. They were indemnified, if you like, from actually any kind of legal action against people within the company, even when they were deliberately, knowingly committing fraud. And then, even though they've been fined for those, malpractice, if you like, or deceiving the public or regulators, they actually end up making more money from profit of the drugs than they do from the criminal investigations and the harm that's, So the system, it's basically a symptom of our system failure. And then, why are we even talking about this? Well, what's happening to population health? You said earlier that, a lot of hospital admissions in the elderly are because of dangerous drug interactions, about a quarter, actually. One estimate suggests that the third most common cause of death after heart disease and cancer is prescribed medications. In the UK, we've had a stalling life expectancy since 2010. And now, in the last few years, we've seen that in many parts of the country, healthy life expectancy has reduced. And at the root of this problem, of course, we've talked about obesity and lifestyle, but what's the twin evil, if you like, that's affecting population health in a negative way is essentially too much unchecked power of industries whose only motivation is profit, not to look after your health.
Dr. Asim Malhotra, thank you so much for coming to the studio and bringing us this really startling story. Always good to have you on. Benedict, I'm going to come to you. I mean, when I read this report and looked at those statistics, I was horrified. I was absolutely horrified. What's your response to this?
Well, you might have been horrified, but were you surprised when you thought about it? I'm not particularly surprised to hear that this sort of thing goes on in the medical establishment, because actually it happens in sort of just about every big industry where you have that sort of crossover between lucrative government contracts, the need for an independent regulator and the free market. Is that ultimately, as Dr. Malhotra says, it's not about your well-being, it's about making money. It's about pushing as many of the pills or the treatments down your throat as possible. Sometimes, often, it is very beneficial, but not always. And I think, when you juxtapose that with how much, for example, the NHS pays for contracts to buy a lot of these treatments, I can't remember what the stat is about how much more expensive it is to take a paracetamol that's been given to you by the NHS than it is to buy one over the counter. You begin to see it's a culture of waste, but it's not really about waste because somebody's profiting quite massively off of this. And you'll see this in lots of other areas. You'll see it, for example, in military contracts. You even see it in sport, the number sort of crossover of how much money a governing body gets from the people that it's supposed to be governing, but also the crossover in terms of people who have worked in one aspect of the industry who then end up going to work for the regulator, or, for example, have worked in government in that area and then have gone to work for the regulator and then gone to work for... do you see what I mean? You've got this network going on where lots of people who ought to be sort of above the fray, they ought to be very sort of rational and independent of all of these things, actually, by their very nature, by being industry insiders and experts, which is what you want in order to regulate it, they're perhaps not going into things with your best interest as the consumer at heart, because they want you to consume.
Well, we approached the UK's Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency for a statement on the British Medical Journal's investigation, and a spokesperson said all our regulatory decisions are based on the safety, quality and effectiveness of the medicine under review and are in no way influenced by the set fees we charge for the services we provide to the industry. All independent experts that advise us are robustly managed according to our strict code of practice. Asim, does that reassure you, reading that, or, do you... Not
at all. I mean, let's just look at the reality of, as I've highlighted already, population health is getting worse. And a lot of it is driven because of false perceptions about the benefits of these drugs. Harms are underplayed. It causes huge damage. And I think the one thing to say is, I think people are well-intentioned, but the problem is these conflicts of interest create this system, they contribute to this system failure, and money clouds judgment.
Dr. Asim Malhotra, Benedict Spence, thank you ever so much. Well, moving on, every day before the show, we delve into the stories making the headlines and those making a splash on social media. But because we don't have time to get into all of it in detail, we're bringing you the update, a roundup of the burning issues that caught our eye. Well, forget imperial measures. A big Brexit benefit has come in the form of the Prime Minister today announcing he plans to slash tariffs on imported food. In the EU, the bloc decided what taxes were put on the stuff ending up on our supermarket shelves, mainly to protect farmers in Europe also producing it. Well, now we're out, and as a country that doesn't grow oranges, olives and rice, for instance, we are free to slash tariffs and hand those savings down to the consumer. Savings of up to 10%. Finally, Boris is flexing a Brexit bicep. Now admit it, you wanted that bullying report into Meghan Markle to come out. The Queen paid for a big law firm to investigate whether the Duchess of Sussex had harangued staff after it was reported she forced out 2 PAs and left other workers shaking in fear. Well, alas, we have learned today that the report will almost certainly never be made public. The palace has said that lessons have been learned from it and the rest is confidential to protect those involved. And while it's classy of the Queen not to stir up the hornet's nest, we all kind of wished she would. Now, children who have been treated for gender dysphoria in the last 10 years will have their medical records scrutinised to assess whether the service is harming vulnerable adolescents. Health Secretary Sajid Javid is changing the law to allow researchers to study data on around 9,000 people to see if they suffered health problems as a result of treatment. Currently, when people change gender, they get a new NHS number, essentially wiping out past records. And as if we didn't have enough supranational bodies, Emmanuel Macron wants to make another and is pushing the concept at every available opportunity. He wants to make a European political community of countries adhering to the EU's core values, but who don't have to be EU members, to cooperate on security, energy, transport, infrastructure, and the free movement of people. While France claims Boris was up for the idea, our Prime Minister claimed he came up with it in the first place, saying it should mirror the Roman Empire and include Turkey and North African states. But Boris then realised he supposedly got Brexit done, adding it was important to build up relationships between countries rather than inventing new structures. Benedict, any of those stand out for you?
I'm absolutely staggered to learn that if you have gender reassignment surgery, they give you a new NHS number, I had no idea that that was the case. And you would have thought that given that somebody who a lot of people who have gender reassignment surgery have a history of, amongst other things, mental issues, which often they'll need treatment, I would have thought that would have been something that would have been nipped in the bud right at the very start when this began to increase. Honestly, I can't think of a bigger sort of oversight in terms of the duty of care. That really, that's completely bowled me over. It's almost left me speechless. The idea that could have just been allowed to slip through the net.
Yeah, good point there. Thank you, Benedict. It is, of course, becoming far more commonplace for young people to seek gender reassignment, so much needed work being done by the Health Secretary there. We have much more coming up in the next hour, but before we get stuck into the big issues like NATO expansionism and the threats that China poses to the West, we're going to take a short break. Back in a second.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Hello and welcome to the second hour of We Need to Talk About on GB News with me, Alex Phillips, where we get stuck into the issues that we need to look at in depth. Nothing is off the table and and no one will be cancelled for saying what they think. Keeping me company today is writer and commentator Benedict Spence. And here's what we've got coming up on the second half of this show. As the NATO summit in Madrid comes to an end, we will be discussing the consequences of NATO expansionism and the new package of support put forward by the West for Ukraine. Are we too focused on arms, though, forgetting the threat of modern warfare, especially cyber? And a blistering report into dirty money in the UK has been released today by the Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. We'll be speaking to its chair, Tom Tugendhat, about why Britain is a laundromat for Kremlin kleptocrats. And disgraced US singer R. Kelly has been sentenced to 30 years for charges of shocking sexual abuse spanning decades. We'll be looking at that in depth. That's what we're talking about for the next hour. What do you need to talk about? GBViews at gbnews.uk, or you can tweet us at GBNews. First, though, it's time for the GB News headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 1 minute past 3. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The mother and stepfather of 5-year-old Logan Mwangi have been jailed for life for his murder. The youngster's battered body was found dumped in the River Ogmore in Bridgend, South Wales in July last year. He'd suffered 56 cuts and bruises as well as catastrophic internal injuries. His mother, Angharad Williamson, will serve a minimum term of 28 years. His stepfather, John Cole, will serve a minimum of 29. A 14-year-old boy who can't be named for legal reasons will serve a minimum of 15 years. Senior Investigating Officer Detective Inspector Leanne Rees says the sentences have delivered justice for Logan's father.
It's incomprehensible that Logan had his life cut short in such tragic circumstances at the hands of those very people who should have been there to protect him. For Logan's father, Ben, who stands beside me, today's sentences are welcome news. However, no amount of justice can bring Logan back or compensate for the grief that continues to be felt.
The Prime Minister has promised to increase defence spending by £55 billion for the rest of the decade. The move is in response to the threat posed by Russia. The figure is 2.5% of GDP, which is a measure of the size of the economy. The UK also announced an extra £1 billion of military aid to help Ukraine. Speaking on the last day of the NATO summit in Madrid earlier, Boris Johnson said the country has the power to repel Russia.
We need to explode the myth that it was in any way NATO that had responsibility for provoking the conflict. Nothing could be further from the truth. And if you want proof that NATO is a purely defensive alliance, you could have no more eloquent testimony than the accession of Finland and Sweden, quintessentially peace-loving countries.
Well, also at the NATO summit, President Joe Biden said the US will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, adding the alliance is now more united than ever.
At this summit, we rallied our alliances to meet both the direct threats of Russia poses to Europe and the systemic challenges that China poses to a rules-based world order. And we've invited 2 new members to join NATO. It was a historic act, Finland and Sweden, 2 countries with a long tradition of neutrality and choosing to join NATO.
Meanwhile, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said that when it comes to Russian aggression, the alliance is preparing for any eventuality.
We face the most serious security situation in decades, but we are rising to the challenge with unity and resolve. The decisions you have taken in Madrid will ensure that our alliance continue to preserve peace, prevent conflict, and protect our people and our values. Europe and North America standing together in NATO.
A former trade union boss has insisted British Airways must reverse its 10% pay cut for workers in order to tackle airport delays. That as Heathrow's ordered the cancellation of 30 flights. Thousands of travellers were disrupted by a rare schedule intervention today, with many not realising their journey had been scrapped until they arrived at the airport. Heathrow bosses say they're working with airlines to get those affected rebooked on alternative flights. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now it's back to Alex with We Need to Talk About.
Russia may have surprised the world when it invaded Ukraine, but perhaps what was the most surprising was the choice to launch a grueling and now protracted conventional war using troops and tanks, guns and missiles. The country, infamous for its cyber meddling, misinformation and modern information warfare, rolled out a fleet of heavy artillery rather than hackers. Has the Kremlin redeployed its keyboard warriors? Hardly. Last night, Lithuania came under an intense cyber attack from a Russian group with links to the state after it sanctioned Russian goods crossing its territory into the neighbouring Kremlin-controlled enclave of Kaliningrad. Fears are now mounting that tensions could spiral, with the Russian territory becoming a new flashpoint in the Ukraine war. Meanwhile, Norway has also been cyber blitzed, with the country's largest electronic banking identification system coming under attack, as well as Norway's largest newspaper, while several of the country's public websites crashed after being subjective to massive hits. Are we becoming too focused on arms in this conflict, forgetting the threat of cyber attack? Well, joining me now on the show is James Bohr, who's the director of Bohr's Group, which is a security consultancy business. James, fantastic to have you on. Now, often when we're talking about Russia, cyber, it seems to be framed in things such as meddling in elections, possibly espionage, some mischievous acts that do disrupt but don't cause severe harm. But what sort of things could cyber warfare be used to do? How far can it be pushed?
It can be pushed quite a way, but it's very unlikely to happen because of the consequences of doing that. So most likely we'll see more of what we've already seen, the sort of denial of service attacks that we're seeing in Norway and that we've seen in Lithuania, huge misinformation and disinformation campaigns, and we're seeing those happen both inside and outside Russia. And all of the normal cyber criminal activity that goes on, that's getting louder and more prominent, but it's not organised. It's not a military attack. It is purely opportunistic criminality, which is originating, as it has done for years, in Russia.
In terms of when you talk about sort of military level cyber attack, is this the sort of thing that could penetrate and disrupt major infrastructure systems, for example?
So we have seen that happen, and we did see it happen in Ukraine some years ago with attacks on the national grid. Potentially, it's possible. However, the Ukrainian national grid at the time was not particularly secure. It was using old hardware. It was not kept up to date. And so it was more vulnerable to these attacks than many other more developed nations are. And on top of that, there's been time since then to continue working on and improving critical national infrastructure and securing it. So it's possible, it's extremely unlikely, not only because there's been more effort put into security of these critical systems, but also because it would be a level of escalation which no one really wants to see.
My suspicion is when it comes to using cyber warfare, there are two different tiers to this, one being what we have just discussed there and having to create robust defences to protect critical infrastructure from being shut down or manipulated. But then the other is on the misinformation level and manipulating the public into believing certain things or acting in a certain way. How much does countries such as Russia have a pernicious influence when it comes to trying to divide our society through use of things like bots as well?
It really can't be overstated. So Russia famously has troll farms or troll factories where they will have people sitting there making posts on social media, amplifying particular things and trying to spread simply disruption, chaos and disinformation. So it's conspiracy theories and encouragement of those. Not all that they've generated these stories, it's that they are helping to spread and amplify and support them to cause more societal chaos.
And how protected are we from that? I mean, I'm reassured to hear that it sounds as if we're relatively capable of defending ourselves from a particularly harmful attack on military scale. But when it comes to this amplification of social tensions and the influence that social media is increasingly having, have we got enough protections in place to deal with that?
Frankly, no. There was an incident a few years ago with a 5G tower being burned down and engineers working on them being attacked. And that was due to the spread of the 5G conspiracy theories. And those were amplified by these elements who like to go out and step up the stories and caused what we have to call domestic terrorism in this country through radicalisation to believe a conspiracy theory.
There has been much talk of increasing our defence budget spending today from 2.3% to 2.5%, and criticism that perhaps in times past we had deployed too much of that budget towards things such as cyber protection rather than conventional arms systems. But would we be making a big mistake if we were to become complacent in this area?
We definitely can't afford to become complacent, but it's not due to a lack of investment in the technology. It's due to a lack of investment in and skill building in the people. There simply aren't enough good people available to do work that needs to be done. And in many companies, in many organisations, there isn't the investment to bring the people who could do the work on board. So we really can't afford to become complacent. There is a huge problem here. It's just not down to a lack of investment in technology.
James, thank you ever so much. It's a fascinating subject. James Bohr there, who's director of the Bohr's Group. Now, as NATO leaders discuss how to handle the major geopolitical threats of the 21st century, focus has been on rearming and mass deployment of troops on its territories. But what of other vital defence systems? Joining me now is security expert Robert Clark. Robert, great to have you on the programme. I mean, the budget's gone up 2.3% to 2.5%. Apparently, Ben Wallace called the old percentage outdated. That line scrapped from his speech, allegedly by 10 Downing Street. Is 2.5% going to be enough?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think it's certainly relevant in the when we consider the threats facing both Britain and NATO today. Look, people get kind of fixated on percentages. 2%, is it 2.3%? But I think more work needs to be done really when we consider what we actually classify as defence spending. So, for instance, the extra £1 billion, which is obviously going to be well spent assisting Ukraine's defences. The Prime Minister is allocating that to the British defence budget, but as Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, quite rightly stated, this doesn't actually enable British defence any more so than it did before. So we have to actually really sort of work out more what we want to do with our defence spending and what we want to do with the money. It's obviously welcome. I've been petitioning this myself, and lobbying for an increase in defence spending have many people over the last few years, when we can see really the sort of the new realities facing British security. And I think Ukraine is just really typifying that. And there's a lot more work to be done, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. Absolutely.
I mean, big lines coming out from NATO today of bigger budgets and bigger troop deployments. Currently, the Eastern Front Line has just 30,000 troops on it, many of those American. NATO's ambition is to turn that into 300,000. But my understanding is there's a lot of haggling between countries of quite who is going to provide those boots on the ground. Do you think that a lot of this is necessary rhetoric, but is not going to be backed up with action?
No, absolutely. I do think it will be backed up by action. So, for example, this is the new NATO operating model that was really announced in the last sort of 48 hours in the Madrid summit. And they've actually stated already the deadline for this to be operational is by 2023, so only next year. So the proof will very much be in the pudding within the next 12 months. In terms of different allies contributing different amounts, we can already see the British contingent to Estonia is going to be, in effect, trebled in size from what has been around about 1,000 soldiers to a brigade level now of 3,000. There's going to be increased American presence in Romania, in Poland, and the Baltics. But one of the interesting concepts behind this is how different allied nations are going to have their force readiness levels at different levels. So, for example, they can contribute different numbers in a different time scale. So that's not saying 300,000 soldiers are going to be instantly deployable. That's talking about a more general idea of upscaling force readiness across different nations' armies. So it's an interesting concept. It's flexible. It will come down to a lot of organisation at different levels in different countries. I think Britain is well poised to contribute to this. We can already see the recently appointed Chief of the General Staff, General Sir Patrick Sanders, has stated his number one aim for the army now is mobilisation and high readiness. So, again, a very welcome step in the right direction.
Many are saying that this is an extremely historic NATO summit, particularly with the two new members of Finland and Sweden being approved, and big headlines as well about the amount of stuff America's sending over, including air defence weaponry and jets. Putting this entire mosaic together, how prepared do you think NATO now is to really stand up for Western values across the world?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think NATO have been prepared for a long time to defend the interests in the Euro-Atlantic region, particularly, obviously, as we talk about Eastern Europe. But you mentioned there the rest of the world. The NATO Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, and even US President Joe Biden this week have both identified China as an increasing challenge to the alliance and to the security of allies. This is something that's going to go way past the events of Ukraine and Russia and Eastern Europe when we look at the long-term systemic threats to NATO's collective security more globally. So I think this increase in defence spending, the increased force postures, increased readiness and high readiness levels are, again, certainly the right steps in the direction needed when we consider the wider threat to the global security environment, which Russia doesn't really pose the same challenges that China do. So again, I think it's very interesting that now the rhetoric and the messaging is, again, starting to identify China a lot more implicitly and explicitly as to the threats that they pose for NATO.
Now, interesting that let's go back to Russia and also tie China into this, because the addition of Finland and Sweden, initially when it was first announced, there was a bit of a pregnant pause from the Kremlin, a degree of ambivalence maybe. But now Putin saying that if there were troops and weaponry deployed to those countries, he would react. And China equally talking tough on NATO expansion, and conversations today about whether Taiwan should be preemptively armed. Is there a risk that NATO could be provocative as opposed to preventative?
Well, I mean, NATO has always been a defensive alliance in terms of for anybody, any entity to be provocative, that's in the eye of the beholder. So in this case, China and Russia and how they view NATO. This is one reason why historically NATO have been very careful about messaging and communicating so precisely they don't give off the wrong intention to adversaries like Russia and China. In terms of Taiwan and the possibility of NATO being drawn into, for example, a conflict with China, it's well known that China's long-term strategic intention is to reintegrate Taiwan by force if necessary to mainland China. America are very adamant about defending Taiwan's integrity and sovereignty. And obviously, America are part of NATO. So there's a very big question to be asked regarding Taiwan. Britain and a lot of NATO members have repeatedly stated their democratic support for Taiwan. But when push comes to shove, and shove it may well do with China in the coming decade or so, it's a very important question. And it's something that really NATO are going to have to grapple with over the next few years, I'm afraid.
Yeah, indeed. Robert Clark, thank you so much for your contribution to today's show, security experts. Well, joining me on the show, as my presenter friend, is political commentator Benedict Spence. Benedict, I want to pivot back to the expansion of NATO and look at the relevance and the strategic importance of having Finland and Sweden in the alliance. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's slightly amusing when you hear Boris Johnson coming out and saying that NATO is essentially a defensive alliance, even as it's expanding its borders. You know, I wouldn't phrase this as an aggressive alliance, but it's a conservative one. But it's wrong to say that it is entirely about defence. Especially when at one end you've got the United States, which is a very sort of expansionist power and has had all sorts of jaunts around the world, and at the other end you have Turkey, which has lots of special interests in its neighbours, and if it was able to, would probably take some of their territory as well. So, you know, it's wrong to say that NATO is purely defensive in that respect. By its very nature, it needs to expand in order to defend itself. When it comes to Finland and Sweden, they're countries that didn't actually need to join NATO. I mean, they're two, sort of per head, they're two of the most tooled-up countries on earth, Finland especially. But again, it's a demonstration to Russia, but also, I suppose, to China, of saying that NATO is not, in fact, simply a defensive organisation. It is prepared to push forward its borders where it feels threatened, in much the same way as Russia is talking about it feeling threatened and therefore needing to push forward into other states. What NATO is saying is that it can do it without having to go to war with people. It's able to say, well, you know, it's us or them. You can either join us and, you know, you can be protected essentially with the US dollar, or you can become, you know, something caught on the front line between us and Russia or China. That ultimately is the nature of NATO's, I suppose, Western expansionism nowadays. It's more sort of cost-effective, certainly in terms of human life, but also in terms of finance, than Russia's technique. And it is saber-rattling. It's saying to Russia, well, look, you know, you can menace these countries if you want, but we're going to be able to put American planes on these countries' territory. We're going to be able to put nuclear submarines in their water, which, you know, they didn't need necessarily, but we can now do that. What's your response to that? And of course, Russia's response is to meddle in the affairs of its poorer neighbours, places like Ukraine, places like Georgia, but it's not going to be able to do anything with those countries or the Baltic states. As much as we talk about those potential flashpoints, it's not going to be able to without provoking a war with NATO, and you know it can't do that.
Benedict, thank you so much. Here with GB News on TV and radio coming up. We're going to be talking about the Logan Mwangi case as his mother and stepfather are sentenced to life in prison for his murder. Before that, though, it's time for a short break.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain every Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m. A news hour that comes with a trigger warning. Scorching hot opinion with prominent guests saying the unsayable and a little bit of weekend fun thrown in. Unlike other broadcasters, I won't be forgetting what the B in our name stands for. So howie in for Real Britain Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
Welcome back. You're with Alex Phillips on GB News. The mother and stepfather of 5-year-old Logan Mwangi have been jailed for life this afternoon for his murder. Angharad Williamson and John Cole were found guilty in April. A 14-year-old boy who cannot be named because of his age was detained for a minimum of 15 years after also being found guilty of Logan's murder. Logan Mwangi's body was dumped in a river after suffering what prosecutors called a brutal and sustained attack. It's the latest in a string of appalling and tragic murders of children by their own parents. GB News reporter Jeff Moody has the background to this case.
A mother's worst nightmare.
Please help me, please.
Where are you?
My son's not here. My boyfriend's not here. Help
Take a breath.
Please.
Take a breath.
Except this was an elaborate performance, as was this.
I feel so useless, Dad.
I know. By the time police arrived at the house of 5-year-old Logan Mwangi, the little boy was already dead, and his mother knew it. He'd been the victim of a brutal and sustained assault. Prosecutors say he'd suffered 56 internal injuries, injuries usually seen only in victims of a high-speed car crash. In July last year, he tested positive for COVID. His mother and stepfather made him stand for hours on end, facing the wall, racist taunts ringing in his ears. And they kept him prisoner. Within days, he was dead. It was this footage that first aroused suspicions. While Logan's mother breaks down, the washing machine is at full pelt. It's stuffed with bloody sheets from the boy's bed. And then came this, CCTV footage from neighbours showing John Cole and another boy removing Logan's body from the house, dumping it in the River Ogmore. Logan Mwangi's mother, Angharad Williamson, his stepfather John Cole and a third defendant, a 14-year-old boy who cannot be named for legal reasons, pleaded not guilty to murder at Cardiff Crown Court, but a jury found otherwise. After the verdict, Logan's father spoke of the most beautiful boy whose life had been cut tragically short.
The world is a colder and darker place without his smile and happy energy in which he lived his life. The hole that has been left in the hearts of all who knew and loved him will never be filled.
The authorities already knew Logan was at risk. He'd been on the Child Protection Register but was removed just a month before his death. A child practice review will now examine in detail the actions of the authorities. A report is due in the autumn. Only then will the question be answered. Could more have been done to save this little boy's life? Jeff Moody, GB News.
Well, Jeff Moody joins us now live from Cardiff Crown Court. Jeff, it was an emotional and harrowing case. Tell us what happened in court.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the judge, Mrs. Justice Jefford, said in her sentencing, it is impossible to imagine the terror in a 5-year-old boy at the hands of the people who were meant to protect him. She went on to say that Logan would have suffered anguish at seeing his own mother take part in his murder. Well, Angharad Williamson, the mother, broke down in tears when the sentencing was read out. There were visible gasps from everybody in the gallery too. Logan's father, in his victim's statement, said afterwards, "I am devastated. I wasn't there to protect him." He's talked about having nightmares and waking up screaming and crying, and he says no amount of time can heal the wounds inflicted. But immediately after the sentencing, South Wales Police had this to say on the steps of Cardiff Crown Court.
It's incomprehensible that Logan had his life cut short
in such tragic circumstances at the hands of those very people who should have been there to protect him. For Logan's father Ben, who stands beside me, today's sentences are welcome news. However, no amount of justice can bring Logan back or compensate for the grief that continues to be felt.
Well, as you say, Alex, it has been a very emotional case, and the judge has said that everybody that did jury service on this trial will be excused from jury service for the rest of their lives. As I said in my report, Logan was on the Child Protection Register, but he was removed 1 month before his murder. We know that a social worker came to visit him days before his death, but was told that he had COVID and was isolating, and no one was allowed to see him. Now a review will be carried out to see if there's more that could have been done to save this little boy's life.
Jeff Moody reporting from Cardiff Crown Court. You're with GB News on TV and DAB Radio. Coming up, we'll be discussing Putin's cronies and if the UK bears some responsibility for propping them up. Now, though, it's time for a check on the news headlines.
It's 3:31. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The mother and stepfather of 5-year-old Logan Mwangi have been jailed for life after being convicted of his murder. His battered body was found dumped in the River Ogmore in Bridgend, South Wales in July last year. His mother, Angharad Williamson, will serve a minimum term of 28 years. His stepfather, John Cole, will serve a minimum of 29. A 14-year-old boy who can't be named for legal reasons will serve a minimum of 15 years. Senior Investigating Officer Detective Inspector Leanne Rees says the sentences have delivered justice for Logan's father.
It's incomprehensible that Logan had his life cut short in such tragic circumstances at the hands of those very people who should have been there to protect him. For Logan's father Ben, who stands beside me, today's sentences are welcome news. However, no amount of justice can bring Logan back or compensate for the grief that continues to be felt.
The Prime Minister has promised to increase defence spending by £55 billion for the rest of the decade. The move's in response to the threat posed by Russia. The UK has also announced an extra £1 billion in military aid to help Ukraine. Speaking on the last day of the NATO summit in Madrid, Boris Johnson said the country has the power to repel Russia.
We need to explode the myth that it was in any way NATO that had responsibility for provoking the conflict. Nothing could be further from the truth. And if you want proof that NATO is a purely defensive alliance, you could have no more eloquent testimony than the accession of Finland and Sweden, quintessentially peace-loving countries.
And thousands of travellers have had their holidays disrupted after Heathrow ordered the cancellation of 30 flights this morning. The rare schedule intervention came as the airport struggled with passenger numbers. Heathrow bosses say they're working with airlines to get those affected rebooked on alternative flights. TV online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.218 and 1.168 euros. The price of gold currently stands at £1,491.92 per ounce.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for real-time investment.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
It's too easy to think of a war almost 2,000 miles away as a distant problem. A desperate situation in which we can morally choose to nobly intervene, with ramifications being strategic and economic. But what about when it emerges we have aided and abetted the very regime now inflicting war on innocent civilians by laundering their dirty money? A British parliamentary report today has criticised the government's failure to crack down on Russian kleptocrats, despite a flood of promises and slew of sanctions. For too long, London has been a laundromat of illicit loot, with the Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee saying tough talk had not been followed up by sufficiently strong and concrete measures. Well, I'm joined now by the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat. Tom, fantastic to have you on the programme. How bad is Britain when it comes to laundering dirty money?
Well, very sadly, Alex, the truth is that we are one of the worst in the world. It's us and the United States. Now, this is not just down to our laws. Actually, our laws are pretty good, but it's down to the size of our markets. The reality is that if you have an exchange the size of the city or an exchange the size of New York, funnily enough, you're going to have a lot more dirty money than a smaller market. Now, this doesn't mean there's nothing we can do about it. There's plenty we can do about it, but we need to resource our law enforcement agencies properly.
And how does this play into the situation we currently have in Ukraine? Is it just a case of some of Putin's cronies being able to hide their ill-gotten gains, or is this actually actively funding the Russian war machine?
Well, some of it is, as you say, hiding ill-gotten gains. There's this money stolen off the Russian people. Let's not forget the first victims of the Putin regime are the Russian people themselves. That money is stolen and then hidden in apartments and estate agents, or through estate agents rather, in the UK and around the world. That's part of it. But also some of it is then used, it's effectively cleaned, if you like, in the London laundromat. And it's then used to undermine British security around the world, to, for example, launch attacks on the Prime Minister of Montenegro, or to spread disinformation in Germany, or even here in the UK to fund operations like the attempted murder of the Skripals using chemical weapons in Salisbury, or using nuclear chemicals here in London.
And the government have announced the Economic Crime Act in April this year, triggered, no doubt, by the invasion of Ukraine. But does that have enough teeth to bite where it matters?
Yes, well, I'm very glad that they did. They were dropping it initially, and I'm very glad that they decided to bring it back. And I'm sure Ukraine focused minds on that. But this isn't just about Ukraine. This isn't just about the Ukrainian people. And, we're absolutely right to be standing with them. And I'm very glad that the government have done the sanctions that they've done. Those are really important. But this is actually about the British people. Alex, look, the reality is that corruption in the city, in estate agencies, in the law, in the UK, or rather the handling of dirty money, spreads a corruption that is bad for all of us. Not only does it inflate house prices, it undermines trust and it erodes confidence in our democratic and legal systems. So it's really important for the British people, for us, for you, for me, and for our friends and neighbours that we sort this out. This isn't about Ukraine. It's not about Eastern Europe. It's not even about Russia. It's about keeping ourselves safe.
I mean, on that point, Russia obviously being the highlight of people likely to be laundering money in our system. But what other countries should we be looking at closely?
Well, very sadly, there are several Central Asian republics. There are also Ukraine itself, up until Zelensky, and even, sadly, some of the oligarchs still active, or at least were active in Ukraine up until about a year or so ago, were using London. And we also know, of course, of China, where the Red Princes of the Communist Party, all is not quite equal there, were also stealing millions and millions of dollars off the Chinese people and hiding it in various jurisdictions. So this isn't just about Russia, it's also about corruption around the world. And that's why I say our security is based on the principle that the UK economy is safe, you can rely on it, that the legal system is clean, that the estate agents are doing their job, and so on. And so closing down these illegal sources of funds, closing down this criminality is absolutely essential, not just for making sure that we dissuade bad actors abroad, but in order to protect ourselves here at home.
Do we also perhaps need to be looking at the underbelly of lobbyists and law firms and spin doctors shilling for these kleptocrats?
Yes, I'm afraid you're right there too, Alex. The tragedy is there are many people who, forgive me, but yours and my profession have formerly employed people that you and I probably know who have made decisions that, frankly, are extremely unsavory. And the United States deals with this in various different ways, including a Foreign Agents Registration Act, which, as you know, I support very strongly. The idea that you should be allowed to silently lobby for a dictatorship like China, for example, I think is grossly wrong. And when you see that in the United States, General John Allen has just been forced to resign from his position leading a think tank because he seems to have been lobbying for a foreign government. This has to be an act that takes in everybody from the very top to the very bottom. This has to be something that treats everybody equally. The principle of the rule of law for us has always been equality before the law. But in order to be equal before the law needs to know who you're representing. And that means foreign states as well.
And when it comes to vulnerability of politics, is there a risk that some of these ne'er-do-wells are actually getting undue influence over political parties through donations?
Well, there is always that danger, isn't there? And recently, you'll remember, Alex, there was that story of the Chinese agent who MI5 was so worried about that they made her name public. And she was also qualified as a solicitor in the United Kingdom and was using her money to influence various different politicians. Very sadly, some politicians on the Labour benches, on the Liberal benches, took money off them. And I have to say, it's the sort of thing that we need to have public. If you are a foreign agent, if you are lobbying on behalf of a foreign government, we, the British people, should know who you're lobbying for.
Now let's go back to the top story today, which is, of course, that historic NATO summit. Historic indeed because of the expansion, the addition of Sweden and Finland to the organisation. What is the importance of the UK's role in this, in also creating a treaty with Sweden and Finland in the run-up to them getting full accession to NATO?
Well, I welcome very much that the Prime Minister did sign that treaty with Sweden and Finland. If you like, that was more of a bridging treaty. It was meant to make sure that the duties that would fall on all countries the moment they became NATO members were extended early so that Russia didn't think there was a gap that they could exploit. But look, many of us have been working on these relationships for a long time. As you may be aware, I've been working on a sort of a Viking alliance, if you like, a partnership between the nations of the former Viking empires, sort of Ireland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and so on, and Denmark and the United Kingdom, to try and bring us together and find ways in which we can share best practice in defending ourselves, best practice in exchanging those other areas which are not covered by other treaties or other organizations, but where we can boost each other's economies, boost each other's populations, and really keep ourselves secure. So I have to say, what the UK has been doing, and I hope what the Foreign Affairs Committee has been doing, has been very supportive of all that.
Now, news today as well, the defence budget is going to go up 2.3% to 2.5% as chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Is that enough, in your opinion?
Well, as you know, you can always look at financial inputs, but what interests me as a former army officer is military outputs. What I want to know is what you're going to get for it, because what we need is enough manpower, enough personnel to be able to defend the interests of the British people. And that means, having people on the front line in Estonia. It means being able to train up our allies in Poland. It means supporting our interests in the Falkland Islands and in Cyprus. It means having enough people to train in places like Kenya as well. And of course, all of that demands manpower in, sadly, rather great numbers. Because the reality is it's not we who choose the size of our army. Our enemy chooses the size of our army. We only choose whether we're ready to defend ourselves or not.
Tom Tugendhat, fantastic having you on the programme today, head of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who published that report into Dirty Money in the UK. Well, Benedict Spence, what are your views on this?
Well, there's lots of stuff going on in that interview. It was very good. I suppose this is something that you'll know about, of course, as a former Brexit Party MEP. Of course, one of the great arguments against Britain leaving the European Union that you often heard was, what is our leaving the European Union going to do to the city and the financial services that we offer across the world? We're going to be far less appealing to lots of people to come and do business here if we leave the European Union. Of course, it's one of the great sort of unspoken things is that actually the financial services we offer are not just to nice people, they're not just to clean banks, they're to all and sundry. Any newcomer that wants to do business in the City of London for decades was allowed to do that. And of course, a lot of that was done under the watch of the current Prime Minister when he was Mayor of London. So, I suppose this is part of the problem with a country where so much importance is centred in one area, and that's the City of London, where actually, the entire economy of the United Kingdom sort of relies on London to prop the rest of it up. And I suppose that's one of the benefits that Brexit could bring, is the ability to move ourselves away from an economy that is entirely set up around financial services and therefore does depend on money coming in from not just the places that were named, also, West Africa and the oil industry there and lots of other unsavoury places. Just to round that all off, though, I quite like the idea of sort of re-bringing into existence the idea of some sort of Viking empire opposing Vladimir Putin, because, of course, what was the greatest city that the Vikings founded? It was Kiev, of course, when they made the trail from Scandinavia all the way down to Constantinople in Greece. So that has a nice symmetry to it. And maybe we can bring Kiev back into that post-Nordic empire at some point.
Fantastic comments. Thank you, Benedict. Well, turning our attention now to America, where disgraced singer R. Kelly has been sentenced to 30 years in prison following a conviction in federal court last year on sex trafficking and racketeering charges. Appearing in court yesterday, the disgraced singer remained silent as he heard from some of his accusers, who gave victim impact statements recounting their experiences with the singer. It's a case that's disgusted the world. The sheer extent of the sexual offences and horrific nature of the crimes of the once best-selling male artist of the 90s and one of the world's biggest pop stars spanned over decades, making it one of the most shocking stories of a megastar getting away with mass abuse. Well, joining me now is showbiz reporter Stephanie Tachi. Stephanie, I was a huge fan of R. Kelly back in the day, megastar here, and multiple documentaries now made about the sort of things he was up to. Tell us more. Explain to the audience the sort of things R. Kelly was doing and quite what he's being sent to prison for 30 years for.
Well, this has been like one of the worst kept secrets in the music industry. R. Kelly's abuse on young girls, boys, dates back to the 90s. He first received controversy when he married an R&B singer called Aaliyah at just age 15. And from there, people have always been talking about that marriage and how she was underage and how apparently he impregnated her. And he got away with that for almost like 10, 15 years. And then it wasn't until a few years ago when the Netflix documentary came out called Surviving R. Kelly, his victims were able to have a platform to discuss the abuse that they had been going through with R. Kelly. Most of these people were aspiring singers, aspiring musicians who were actually trying to get mentorship from R. Kelly and trying to look up to him for support, but instead he abused that. He ended up turning most of these people into sex slaves. He ended up blackmailing them. Most of them felt like they didn't have a voice to talk about this abuse. It wasn't until that Netflix documentary came out that people could actually hear these people's testimonies. Whether race has a thing to it is still to be argued. Most of his victims were black, and they said they didn't feel like the police were not taking them seriously. He literally kept most of them as slaves, basically. And it wasn't just him, it was like a ring of them who knew what was going on for years and years. And he's been able to get away with it for beyond decades. And finally, justice has been served.
I mean, the reports are such that he almost kept a harem, didn't he, of very young girls taking away their mobile phones, completely withdrawing them from their families and the outside world. How on earth did this go on for so long?
Well, Alex, it wasn't until the Me Too movement, because as we know, as we're seeing now over the past couple of years, men who have been abusing their power in the showbiz industry, in the Hollywood industry, in the music industry, it's no longer acceptable. Where before this Me Too movement, it was acceptable. It was acceptable for men such as R. Kelly, who are quite narcissistic, to abuse their fame and the power, and they got away with it. But now that culture in Hollywood and the music industry no longer exists. So that's why now, from little small incidents to big incidents now, people have a platform to talk about their abuse and be taken seriously. But this really is a misjustice, because it's been able to go on for years and decades, and no, these people did not have a voice to talk about their abuse. But now that time in Hollywood and the music industry is over. And I hate to say this, I feel like there'll be more stories such as this coming out, as R. Kelly wasn't the only person who was in it. He was operating with other people in the music industry. So this is not the end of this case. He will... Oh, yes. Hello?
Yep, Stefan, no, do carry on. Finish that thought.
Yes, this is not the last of this case, because in August he'll be standing trial again for cases of child pornography and also further offences. So 30 years might just be the minimum R. Kelly will be facing for this.
Yeah, it's really shocking stuff. Stephanie Tachi, it was great to hear from you today. Stephanie Tachi there, who's a showbiz reporter. When it comes to banging my difficult woman drum, I increasingly don't care who it offends. I used to be a feminine basher in my 20s, thinking if I told guys I thought the whole movement was ghastly, I'd be all the more popular. Well, only makes you more popular with the sort of guys your mum doesn't want round to tea. But there's an equally awful other force too, the modern-day metro male feminist. Can't we all just agree men and women are rarely equal, and a lot of the stuff throughout history that recognised these biological differences was actually good? It's time for the Alex Agenda. Oh, gosh, Boris wading into feminism is like watching Kurt Zuma becoming a spokesman for the RSPCA. The father of Lord knows how many love children, who changes his mistress more often than most of us get a haircut, even used that horrific phrase, toxic masculinity, claiming Putin wouldn't have waged a macho war if he was a fine and gentle filly. Like all clumsy attempts of men donning the cringy I'm a feminist T-shirt, it backfired. Surely the Queen of the British Iceni Boudica might have something to say about his Edwardian opinions, or Elizabeth I with her heart and stomach of a king. Even his heroine, Margaret Thatcher, would be right to roll her eyes. But not all women leaders are the good uns either. Bloody Mary I went about burning people at the stake, essentially committing mass genocide, something once lefty pin-up Aung San Suu Kyi might know a bit about. Now, when it does come to feminism, it's action, not words, that count. And sadly, all the posturing does not seem to be making anything any better. The horrific murder of Zara Alina, repeatedly beaten around the head by a stranger, is yet another incidence of a woman in London being savagely attacked by a man. And before I hear the wails of "but men are often the victims of violent crimes," this is a different sort of gruesome attack that leaves all women scared and vulnerable just going about their business. And it's time, I think, policy reflected that. Look, streets are never going to be safe, and so late-night transport should be offered at reduced fares to women. I don't care if it sounds old-fashioned, and I don't care if it's not politically correct. What I care about is if it keeps women safe. Benedict, bit feminist focused there. Want to
you got it all off your chest.
I'm a feminist too T-shirt and try your luck?
I think the one that really sort of stood out for me there was Boris Johnson coming out and coming with that whole thing. Oh, if Vladimir Putin was a woman, it wouldn't have launch an invasion of Ukraine, which, as much as anything else, it's a complete disregard for history, which I was under the impression Boris Johnson was supposed to be a bit of a history buff. But, if he was, he'd know that in the history of Europe, female rulers are about 20% more likely to start wars than their male counterparts, whatever the reasons for that, by the by. But those are the stats. And the other thing, of course, is you're looking at the history of Russia itself. It's almost as if Catherine the Great didn't exist. Somebody who launched all sorts of wars and conflicts and persecutions of people inside her own countries and without. And not a particularly good day for Boris Johnson, who, in the past once sold history books. So not particularly ringing endorsement for him as an expert on that subject. But, as usual, it's that sort of cheap, sort of playing to the gallery. I'm very progressive. I'm very nice. And wouldn't everything be better if everything was run by a woman? Which, as you just pointed out, is very often not the case.
Yeah, and a man who doesn't exactly have the most shining history of respecting the ladies himself.
Well, quite.
Benedict, it's been fantastic having you here for the whole 2 hours. Well done for keeping up with it all. We love it when you're on the programme, so do come back. Benedict Spence, ladies and gentlemen. Well, that's all for me from now. So join me again for We Need to Talk About on GB News, same time, same place, 2 o'clock tomorrow. Coming up next, of course, it's Brazier. But first, let's have a little look at the weather forecast. Bye-bye from me.
Hello, Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update. More thundery showers around through the rest of today, but not everywhere seeing them. Some places staying dry and bright. The winds are light, which means it feels pretty pleasant in the sunshine, but it also means those downpours are slow moving. Not many isobars on the chart, not many fronts either, but in this gap, the sunshine is getting to work and sparking off those slow moving thundery showers. We have a Met Office yellow warning in place. The potential for some disruption as those downpours, as I say, just drag their heels, dropping a lot of rain in a relatively short space of time. The showers fade from Wales and southwest England, but we'll keep some going over the Midlands, northeast England, northeast Scotland through the night. Temperatures dropping down to between about 13 and 10 Celsius. On to Friday, and it is another day of heavy showers breaking out. A wet start for Aberdeenshire and the Northern Isles, and then the showers break out quite widely. Bit more of a breeze tomorrow, so the showers will tend to move through, and actually Wales, southwest England looking largely dry through the afternoon along with Northern Ireland, but some heavy showers again over parts of the east, the risk of hail and thunder. Later in the day, more rain will push into Northern Ireland, and this is likely to turn pretty heavy through the evening with some gusty winds. The thundery showers further east should tend to fade away, but then this line of wet weather will work its way in for the weekends, making for a wet start for quite a few of us on Saturday, and that rain will steadily spread across Wales, England, and north across Scotland. East Anglia in the southeast, probably dry on Saturday, certainly until later on, as that rain then pulls away, looking drier for Wales and southwest England in the afternoon. More showers for Scotland and Northern Ireland. Top temperature on Saturday, the southeast, before the cloud and rain arrives, 23 Celsius, but mostly in the high teens. Still some